Stop. Did you say Heartbleed?
So I'm constantly going, no, stop that, put that down, don't touch that, take that out of your mouth. The vendors are trying to find the problem space as the problem they can solve. Alrighty, let's do it.
Alright, here we go. Today is Tuesday, August 26, 2014, and this is episode 81 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Jerry. Thank you for having me back to the show yet again.
Absolutely. So, before we get into our show, I have some late-breaking news. The late-breaking news is that EC Council now has a certified CISO class.
Well, okay.
Yeah. So now all you got to do is pay, I don't know, a couple $1,000, and you too can be a CISO.
Wow.
That's all it took. I mean, all this time, that was all it took.
So is there a lot of demand for this particular certification?
I have
do you
no
think?
freaking clue.
And so once I go get this, by the way, is Sally Struthers pitching it yet? That's my first question. Second question, can I follow up on my TV VCR repair and move right into this class? And third question,
You can't come up with a third one, can you?
well, I'm just trying to figure out who would hire based on this certification.
I don't know. Well,
And that leads to a broader question of what makes a good CISO to begin with.
It did say that it's based on the A+ framework.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
If it was an A- or even a B+, it's not as
doesn't have the same oomph as.
Well,
A+.
There's a lot of controversy swirling around the Twitterverse this week about the new. I hate saying this, but cyber czar at the White House not being technical. So, not to derail the show at all, because this isn't even in our show notes, but maybe one of these days we should talk about what makes a good CISO, because that's a pretty big topic.
Well, I have to tell you, it's very funny. I was actually reading an article about the new cyber czar and how he's basically flaunting his ignorance when I actually saw the banner ad for the EC Council certified CISO.
It all comes back together.
Yes. There you go.
You know what's bad is I don't even know who the EC Council is. I'm ignorant of
That's
them.
the certified ethical hacker people.
Oh, thank you.
They're the ones whose website kept getting owned about 6 months ago.
Yes, and that's funny. But, however, having worked at security companies in both IT roles and not in IT roles, I can tell you that just because you're a security company does not mean your IT has the budget or the staff they need, right? And
totally
and if
agree.
And this is something that I used to fight so often with executives too. When you're trying to have your revenue generating guys who are out there doing consulting, whatever, come in and do internal work, huge mistake, right? So there needs to be a separation of duties. There needs to be accountability and authority. So just because you're a security company does not mean you have good internal security. That is for sure.
Debatably, I think based on our experience, a lot of times it's cobbler's children type of a situation. So, having said that, we'll get into our stories. Our first story tonight comes from CSO Online, and you actually, there's going to be a theme here. The first story is titled, Community Health Systems Blames China for Recent Data Breach. And CHS apparently discovered that there were around 4.5 million records, which consisted of names, dates of birth, social security numbers, addresses, all of the normal stuff you would need to carry out a very effective ID theft operation, was apparently stolen by a group identified as APT-18 by Mandiant.
Question, what happened to 2 through 17?
I don't know. I'm assuming that some of them are stealing like the toy secrets and...
I'm just curious. I mean, APT-18 seems a big jump. I didn't see the prequels.
We don't know. Hopefully someday we will be talking about them.
All right.
there's
Carry on.
lots more shows to record here, so we gotta keep something. All right, so anyhow, one of the interesting comments in this article is that CHS issued a statement that says it carries cyber/privacy liability insurance to protect itself against certain losses related to matters of this nature. Which, that's becoming kind of a common response. However, this I think was announced last Monday. And then last Tuesday, I wasn't feeling so hot, so I was sitting in front of the TV watching Twitter, and Mr. Dave Kennedy tweeted that he was about to go on Fox News and drop some really big announcement. So I, of course, tuned in, and he's apparently a pretty frequent guest, and the commentators were, as Fox News is wont to do, were really bashing on Obamacare and the healthcare.gov site. And Dave couldn't really get in a word in edgewise, and finally he just blurted it out. CHS got breached by Heartbleed.
Nice.
So,
which I'm assuming the commentators didn't really know exactly what that meant or why that was relevant. As I recall, I don't think they even missed a beat, and they just went right back to bashing healthcare.gov. If we were competent podcasters, right now is when we would play an audio clip of that interview. However, we're just lame guys sitting in a basement. So carry on.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe I'll actually do that.
If we were really cool, we would have that the news guys from Korea who develop reenactments of news stories in animation.
Yes, we'll work on that. That's not in the budget yet, but we'll. So anyhow, the story here is that apparently TrustedSec, which is Dave Kennedy's company, somehow determined that a vulnerable Juniper VPN device that was vulnerable to Heartbleed was apparently the method that the attackers used to get in. So allegedly they used that vulnerability to steal credentials, which then in turn let them get into the network. I as I was thinking about it, I got to wondering, that just lets you into the network. I wonder if, maybe this was a VPN gateway using, let's say, Active Directory for authentication that let the bad guys in deeper into the network. There's really no detail about that, but it's also not clear when CHS patched the device relative to when Heartbleed was announced and when these people attacked it. But it's conceivable that they may have patched it very quickly. However, I guess APT-18, if we're to believe the stories here, apparently was really on the ball and stole some credentials. So we don't really have a good handle on the timeline, but it appears to extend back into early April.
Yeah, it's interesting. In theory, I've not heard of a ton of actual big breaches being caused by Heartbleed. Heartbleed obviously got a ton of press, but this is a pretty big one. Yeah, pretty big news.
Absolutely.
All the more reason, by the way, to utilize two-factor authentication on anything exterior and able to receive anonymous connections.
Yeah, absolutely right. One thing that Dave Kennedy did mention, that he believed this was the first instance of a breach related to Heartbleed, although as it's subsequently been reported, it's actually the third one. There was one in Canada, which I think we talked about at the time.
Yep.
The guy, I think the guy stole 9 records because he was a polite Canadian.
It's true, but that was a substantial portion of Canada.
True. Well, that's true. That's true. Now we lost Canada. Oh well. We just got over 20 listeners too.
We'll be back down to 18. It's okay.
So
sorry, Canada. I like your hockey.
Absolutely.
But I think the key point is it's relatively rare, right? For as much press as that got. Now, you could argue maybe all the press was a good thing to get people to patch and to deal with things very quickly. But as we know, people don't patch
Yeah.
Not everybody, not all the time, especially network gear. This is
That's
one
right.
thing that, can you imagine if we saw a huge issue in Cisco perimeter router? People wouldn't patch. They'd be like, hey.
I would say that in large measure, this probably did impact quite a few Cisco routers. Oh,
Yeah,
well, I guess more ASAs, I suppose.
Yeah, those with, the right libraries and such running. But Juniper SSL VPNs are incredibly prevalent. And I vaguely recall, don't quote me on this, but I vaguely recall there was a pretty big lag in time with Juniper getting their patches out. I may be wrong, but that's what my memory is telling me. I may have to go back and look.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I've read conflicting reports on that. One article said it was really quick, and another said it was, an extended amount of time. So I'm not really sure what it was. But, it's an interesting point that when something like this comes out, there isn't always a patch for a vulnerability that you're faced with.
That's true.
And, that's something that I've seen organizations wrestle with quite a lot. When you talk about vulnerability management, a lot of people default to, they basically equate it with patch management. But it's more complicated than that. And unfortunately, in the case like this, you have to make a decision. What do you do? If you know that your VPN router is susceptible to this attack, but your business relies on it, what are you going to do?
Yeah, it's tough. If you know specifically in this case, we knew specifically it was credential stealing, you could make it harder by using two-factor authentication, but that's not always going to be the case. So you can't easily, with hindsight, you can say, well, if you had employed two-factor authentication, you mitigated this risk to a certain extent, not to zero, but to a certain extent. But what if it's something next time where it's a complete bypass of authentication?
Right.
Right? You don't know, right? So I think it's a matter of at least having the wherewithal to understand that these sorts of events can occur, will occur, and having enough architectural knowledge and security knowledge and cluefulness, and enough spare time to perhaps come up with some sort of game plan to limit that, up into perhaps disabling that service, right? That's a decision that may be made by the organization. It depends on the risk, and it depends on what that service is. I don't know if there is any one right answer, but it's an active, engaged, investigative thought process that businesses need to go through whenever these big events come out and figure out what they need to do for their organization to minimize risk to an acceptable level.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I'll default back to is something we talk about a lot, which is getting back to being able to detect when anomalous things are happening.
Yeah, definitely.
So presumably it's not normal to see someone. We don't really have any detail about how the records were stolen, if it was in one big batch or if it was slowly bleeding out. But hopefully there may have been some signal if it were being watched that could be caught. Otherwise, it is a really difficult situation, and you have to make a business decision when it comes up, and sometimes you take a calculated risk. There was an interesting point brought up in one of these articles, in particular with hospitals. The dynamics and investment around security are much more nuanced than a lot of other areas, because if you're for every dollar you're spending on information security, presumably you're not spending that dollar on patient care or new systems or what have you. And that kind of dovetails actually into the third article, which is also from CSO, titled "More Problems Emerge on the CHS Network." And so a company called Looking Glass checked into CHS's address space, and I assume they did this as a result of the news last week, and they found that 10 of their 12,500 IP addresses were listed as participating in some botnet or other, including the Asprox, Kelios, Configur, Ramdo, Sality, and Zeus botnets. And apparently each of those 10 IP addresses were were being flagged for more than one threat. So it's not really clear exactly what's going on there, but they take some pains to point out that the Conficker one is kind of interesting, because Conficker is something that leverages a very old vulnerability from back in 2008, and it was really prevalent with Windows XP systems. And I think they do pick on the hospital setting a little bit, because there apparently are quite a few XP systems, especially in I guess I would say more of the embedded medical device arena, which again is an interesting topic, because a lot of times those devices are certified. There's a very extensive process that goes into certifying a particular computer with a particular operating system and a particular application connected to a particular piece of hardware. And it's not, you just don't get to apply a service pack.
Much less other third-party software.
Right.
It's a tough problem.
Right.
And I have never worked exclusively in a healthcare environment. We've got a couple of friends who do, and I don't envy them. It goes back to, I think, what you and I have talked about a lot, which is having strong instrumentation to be able to detect compromised hosts as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately these hospital systems are probably going to have to put pressure back on the vendors of these pseudo-embedded systems to allow them to do something like add whitelisting technology or patch or something.
Right.
It's a tough one. And I think this is actually going to be a more prevalent problem going forward. Not to get into long-term predictions, but I somewhat sense we are getting closer to a stasis, if you will, where things like Windows XP can exist for a very, very, very long time, much longer than things in the past were. Windows 7 may be out there for a very long time, especially if Windows keeps screwing up future releases. Because I'm seeing less and less reason, aside from end of support reasons, for businesses to make the upgrade leap. Mm-hmm. We're kind of getting, to the most part, incremental upgrades on new operating systems. There's nothing very revolutionary, they would think otherwise. That's coming. Windows 8 was really not very compelling, aside from perhaps touchscreens, even though there was some nice security stuff in there. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with networking security gear, that if it works, don't touch it. And I'm wondering if we're going to get there as well, to a certain extent, with operating systems. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I see businesses sort of going, hey, we had a huge upgrade cycle, and I've got so much power now, I don't think my spreadsheet's going to get that much more complicated that I need to upgrade.
To be honest, I think that was why we saw so much so much inertia, or whatever you want to call it, behind not moving to XP, or you're basically dragging your feet off of XP, because it just worked for a lot of people. And I think you're on a good point. Whether or not it comes to fruition is another question. But I think that if you look at other areas, like, say, the embedded control market, the industrial control systems, I think that the pieces of medical technology are probably more. We should probably think about them more. And I know I'm oversimplifying, and so I apologize to all the healthcare people out there. We should probably think about those systems more in the light of those industrial control systems than like a administrative PC, a workstation, because they're investments. They serve a dedicated purpose, and usually they're not tweaked. They're just they're put in place for a particular purpose. That you're not constantly adding features and upgrading software. So I think that something has to change, because on the one hand, you can say that, well, here we have this situation where we know these healthcare organizations have these vulnerable systems on their network, and the obvious answer is, well, if you can't upgrade them, you got to wrap something around them, but that costs money too.
Well, then do we go to a model where, in essence, Microsoft is not going to, as much as we would like to, end support, and that we go to a long-term sort of maintenance cycle where you're paying, maintenance costs to keep Microsoft making patches and such?
Possibly so. I wonder if eventually there'll be a move off of XP, or not XP, but a move off of something like Windows as a platform. That's
tough.
It is tough, but at the same time, I think the models seem to be incompatible.
I understand there's many benefits and options out there, but I think the problem you've got for the non-technical community is, for good or ill, Microsoft's paradigm is understood better than Linux or an embedded Linux. Now, when you look at something that's been successful like the iPhone, that has a completely new UI, but it's incredibly intuitive, however, it's also incredibly limited, then we might be able to talk about something as an option, right? Perhaps something like a tightly controlled, tightly patched, very limited configurability box becomes an option for these sorts of situations.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I completely agree with you, especially from a development perspective and a usability perspective. Everybody's familiar with the Microsoft model, both on both ends of the spectrum. But I think there's just an incompatibility between what's needed from a platform and what it can deliver in these particular circumstances. I don't know what that means. If that means that I guess a good option might be, Microsoft has embedded operating systems. Like the Microsoft XP, the Windows XP embedded is supported through, I think, 2019. It's out a few years, right? It didn't end already. But even so, I think there's still a problem that if let's say you're using Windows 7 embedded, I'm not even sure that there is such a thing, right? And tomorrow there's some new network-based vulnerability akin to what we saw in 2008. And to fix that, you require a patch. The problem is that you can't apply that patch to your MRI or your whatever piece of technology until somebody pays a whole bunch of money to take it through the certification process, and that might not happen.
So does this go back to the customers not demanding this from the manufacturers?
Ultimately, I think that's where it has to change.
Yeah. Clearly we don't work in healthcare IT, right?
Yeah. We're pontificating about stuff we don't know anything about.
Right. And so probably all of our listeners in this world are going, you guys are idiots. But but if I look at the basic tenets of supply and demand, and businesses are going to provide for their customers what they have to competitively and what the customers are demanding. So if this is missing, I have to go back to thinking, well, it's because the customers aren't asking for it. And that's not unrare in most of these industries. It's a very specific, odd, stupid little pocket case we're talking about here that somebody who runs a hospital chain isn't ever going to probably even think about in their day-to-day unless somebody brings it to their attention.
Yep, exactly.
So maybe, as much as I hate to say this, it might have to be some sort of compliance initiative.
Wow.
I know. I don't want it that way. But I bet it would have more of a chance of happening under a compliance initiative. Like, compliance dictates must be able to patch, right? Or, you must run whitelisting or, compatible type things to limit the attack surface. I don't know. But
there aren't many good good answers, and clearly it's not working very well.
Yeah.
So, and maybe there are vendors out there that have solved this, and we're talking about the periphery. I don't really know.
And they're screaming to come buy our stuff.
Exactly. All right, so we beat that one to death. Let's move on. Our next story comes from Security Week. The title is Secret Service. Over 1,000 businesses infected with the point of sale malware. So the Secret Service and U.S. CERT and DHS and a whole bunch of other acronyms released a advisory about this backoff malware, which apparently is allegedly the source of a whole bunch of card breaches. And one of the things that is not really well said is how they came to understand how there are 1,000 breaches, 1,000 businesses impacted by this. We can assume that maybe they've seen traffic to and from a botnet. Don't really know, but apparently they are trying to reach out to organizations that they're able to identify which are impacted. And apparently one of those organizations that was impacted was the UPS store. And the UPS store apparently, after seeing the alert on July 31st, they allegedly did some introspection and found that they were actually infected. And so that is how we came to know about that. Backoff is a RAM scraping malware. This is similar in nature to the what happened at Target and PF Chang's and on and on and on. We don't really know for sure if it's the same malware. There's obviously not a whole lot of detail about that particular aspect of it. It's interesting that the apparent method of delivery of this is using remote desktop type tools. So I guess the attackers are essentially scanning organizations' NetBlocks, looking for Microsoft RDP, Apple Remote Desktop, Chrome Remote Desktop, Splashtop, Pulseway, LogMeIn, and I would assume things like VNC and probably others. And when they find them, they run some basic brute force login attempts, and of course, all too often, apparently they're pretty weakly configured. And once the attackers are able to connect, they upload the malware, and it's off to the races. So DHS actually made a couple of recommendations. Some of them are interesting, and I'll just go through them, and then I'll tell you why I think this is maybe a little misguided. So they recommend that retailers, first off, work with their vendors, so their service providers, their antivirus vendors, and anybody else, I guess, maybe their pet groomer, to determine if they've actually been infected by this malware. So, first off, let's figure out if we're infected, and then they give some recommendations on how to avoid infection. Number one is to limit which vendors have access to your network. Seems like pretty good advice. Number two, use long and complex passwords. Number three, use two-factor authentication. Number four, lock out accounts after some failed login attempts. Number four, put the POS systems on a different network. And number five, use card readers that encrypt the data on the reader rather than on the POS terminal. So I think what we'll end up finding, I suspect, is that a lot of these 1,000 companies are probably really small. Pretty small outfits. And what struck me as odd is that this communication is really focused at the retail organizations, and to me it seems like it should also be focused at least as much on the POS vendors and support organizations, because I think a lot of this stuff is generally outside of the control or outside of the day-to-day control of the retailers. You know, the mom and pop retail or the small chain store who's outsourced this responsibility to someone else. You know, those companies are the ones that need to use the long passwords and, you know, make sure that that the lockout, you know, activity lockouts failed login lockouts are enabled, and you know, those kinds of things. So yeah, it's apparently a growing business right now. I'm going to be interested to see what Verizon says about this current spate of RAM scraping malware in their report next year, because, you know, last year in the the report they released earlier this year, they kind of poo-pooed the whole RAM scraping thing, saying that, you know, this is kind of old news. We talked about this, you know, back several years ago, and, you know, you guys, because of Target, are just now talking about it. So I'm really curious to see, is this the summer shark attack story, and now every time something happens we hear about it, or is this really a significant new threat? I'm not really sure. It certainly is hitting the news a lot.
Well, it's something the PCI Council cares about. You know, that 3.0 has some guidance around this as well to minimize, as they call it, pan SAD info in memory unencrypted.
Yeah.
But that's not hardcore sort of requirements, as far as I know. I need to actually read it a little deeper, but it's one of those things that once a technique becomes effective, bad guys are going to copy it.
Yeah. Yep. Obviously, it's you know, I suspect if we ever get into it, there's probably a pretty mechanized marketplace for this. You know, with people delivering it and collecting the card data. I suspect
Sure.
We're going to find out.
I'm sure that these sorts of RAM scraper for credit card data is just part of one of many malware families and in the malware toolkits, and it's easy to enable if you're a bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's got to be dealt with at this point. I think it's reached enough critical mass that it is a meaningful concern.
Yeah. The other item I would say is and I've seen this in a number of different contexts, different venues. A lot of the discussion has been that early in the back-off infection, antivirus wasn't detecting it. But there's kind of this illusion that it is being detected now, and I have to wonder if, you know, is that really overplaying the protection, right? I've got to believe.
And how can you trust that? Okay, one variant got detected today.
Right.
This is not a black or white issue.
Right. But my concern is that I think the way a lot of these alerts and stories are being written is that, yeah, when it first came out, it wasn't detected. However, you know, antivirus now has detection for it, and my concern would be, well, that, you know, we see all too often people get this false sense of security with antivirus, and I think this just kind of plays into that. That's where I'm going. Yeah,
it's too easy to just easily repack and then evade AV again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I get it. I know AV is valuable. I understand that it gets a low-hanging fruit, and I hate to dog it all the time, but at the you know, on the playing field I'm playing on, it's not helping me.
Right.
But then again, we're focusing on the stuff that's bleeding past the AV, so, you know, maybe we have a filter.
True enough. So the last story we have comes from the Naked Security blog. It is actually about the UPS breach, and the title is "The UPS Store Breach: What Went Wrong and What UPS Got Right." So we've already talked about what went wrong. Obviously, there's not specific details about how the attackers entered their network. We do know that 51 of their stores out of 4,470 stores were impacted. But what I thought was most notable, and I think that what this article is really pointing out, is that contrasted with a lot of the other companies, the UPS Store seems to be a lot more forthcoming. So on their website, they didn't have a really good way to go back and reach out to the estimated 100,000 impacted customers and let them know what happened. So what they did was they posted a brief on their website, and their CEO posted an apology, and they listed each of the stores that had been breached. And the article does kind of give a bit of a subtle backhand to Target and Neiman Marcus and Michaels and P.F. Chang's. However, one thing I want to call out is maybe not shenanigans, but close to it. If you look at Target, right? Target had their hand forced, right? They did not disclose on their timeline, right? So Brian Krebs came out and called them out, posted a story. Whereas the UPS Store I think they had almost 2 weeks where they were doing some investigation. And so I think we have to be a little bit cognizant that it appears that the UPS Store had an opportunity to do some investigation. And in fact, they make reference to a IT security company doing some investigation for them. So I do think that we're not comparing apples to apples when we talk about that. However, there is one thing that I will give them credit for that I think most of the other stores are guilty of. They did not claim that this was some super sophisticated attack and a highly advanced malware. And I do want to applaud them for not doing that. So thank you very much. Thank you to Mr. Tim Davis, who is the CEO, for not doing that.
In other news, Jerry's going to get hired by the UPS Store. No, you make a really interesting point, right? When you can manage the timeline and manage the information release, you can manage perception. Now, I'm not saying that this is nefarious in any way, shape, or form, but I am saying that if you can get all of your ducks in a row and manage the message well, you're probably going to be perceived by the market as having a better handle on the situation.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so I think this, I've seen numerous stories about how well the UPS Store has handled this. And they came out, they were very upfront. They very clearly explain what happened. They list the stores that were impacted. And if you look at most of those other cases, at the point in which the news hit the wire, they hadn't done an investigation yet, and so they didn't have an opportunity to manage the message like the UPS Store did. So it is really important, I think, from a PR perspective, to be able to do that. You can't always do it. And from a IT response perspective, it's probably a good idea to think about what you would do in each case, where you can manage the message and where you can't manage the message. So, anyhow, that is the show for this evening. Once again, we are definitely looking forward to DerbyCon. I just counting down the days. It's going to be awesome. And in the meantime, if you have any feedback, please send us an email to info@defensivesecurity.org, or you can hit us up on Twitter @DefensiveSec. You can follow Mr. Kellett on Twitter @Lurg and me on Twitter @MaliciousLink. If you like the podcast, hey, tell a friend, give us a good review on iTunes. And with that, we appreciate you listening, and we'll talk again next week.
Thank you, guys. Good night.
Take care.